Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right. And this is Tom Navolis, your host, and I'm so delighted that you are back here with me today. We have, as always, so many things to cover, and I don't know what I'm going to get done. It's one of those things, as Kathy says, is that when I get on a roll, I can get on that roll and I'll just ramble on right through. So we'll see what's going to happen. So here's what I want to do. Here's what I'm going to attempt to do. I'm going to attempt to, in the first segment, cover this whole issue of social justice in the churches. What's happening with that? And I want to give you some context of that from what I'm reading to my grandkids online. As you well know, that I have it on SamuelAdamsReturns.net, as well as then that has links to Facebook, is none other than the 1864 book that is The Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution. I think it's relative. As I always say, there are most of the pastors in America today could not hold a candle to those founding pastors. And there's reasons for that. Secondly, what I definitely am going to begin to cover and bring to you again in the second segment is the context of George Washington's farewell address in relationship to what's happening with President Trump and what he is doing, especially on the international perspective, in commerce treaties and so forth. We have those principles upon which we are built. And it's interesting to me that I really believe that there are some people inside the Trump administration, some counselors that are a part of what he is doing, that in fact understand foundational principles. I just honestly believe that. And to the extent that President Trump is a genius, he's probably got it figured out from foundational principles somewhere along the line and things that he's either read, seen, interacted with, or I don't know. But the man is just a genius. Last segment, I want to try and draw a couple resources together. I want to pick up on one of the resources that I began speaking about last week, that being conforming the world to the church, rather, to the New World Order. Just so much information. I had to rush through that ending of that last week and tying it in with a new site, if you will, and it's all in the references, as always, is authorityresearch.com. Just some really great stuff that ties all of that together in a couple different ways. So let's get started if we can. We're going to get started with some really interesting news here in Ohio. I think it's fabulous, wonderful. The whole idea that a court ruling came down this past week that is super exciting. Back a few years ago, Governor Kasich signed a bill to defund, or not defund per se, but not use taxpayer money to fund Planned Parenthood's abortions. And that everything that would be real health care for women should be funded. That's not a problem. But if there was an abortion facility within that, and that is where monies were going, taxpayer money, then the legislation said no, the taxpayer money cannot go to abortion. Well, that went through the court process, and a couple of judges said, oh, that's unconstitutional, and then it bubbled all the way up into the appellate court. And the appellate court came back this week saying that the Ohio law is in fact constitutional because, in a short sentence, there will be no harm to Planned Parenthood if taxpayer money is withheld from the abortions, especially the way that the whole court process went. You got to read, it's very, very interesting. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but you can. The other very exciting bill that is again making its way through the legislature is the heartbeat bill. It made its way through the Ohio Senate, passed the Senate, except for three Republicans that did not sign that. And I will be meeting with one of those senators in a couple weeks, and I'm going to ask him, why didn't he do that? I know he's termed out, so he's not going to get elected again. But why is it, especially being a Catholic, that he did not take and sign on to the heartbeat bill? It's very disconcerting. It's now on its way to the House. We'll see where it goes. Ohio's Governor DeWine has promised that he will sign the bill as passed and gets through the legislature. So we're pretty excited to see where that goes for the House. On the flip side of things, not related to that, but related to local taxation, if you will, which Sam Adams was very, very concerned about, was the idea that, again, moving through the Ohio legislature is none other than the infamous gas tax. And that's going on in several other states as well, is to raise that gas tax. And it's really amazing is that you got to go read all the stuff on it, folks. It's just a matter of collusion with the unions, paybacks, the way that taxation is happening, what happens with levies. I mean, it just gets into this whole tangled mess. In other words, government has done a bad job of managing its money in the state of Ohio under the Kasich regime, to the extent that there are now bonds due. And so to take and you see it in your own state, you see it in your own government, it gets really convoluted. So there's no clear manner, there's no clear plan. And the thing that's really, really, really ugly inside that bill is that there is tens of millions of dollars for fantasy. Fantasy being the sustainability of self-driving vehicles, of all of these other Agenda 2030, if you want to use the tinfoil hat, which it's not a tinfoil hat stuff. Go look at you and Agenda 2030 and so on and so forth. It's all fact, that it's all there, that there is tens of millions of dollars going to what I call fantasy, where somebody's going to make a lot of money. These are private-public partnerships, which I've talked about in the past, are corruption. Okay, moving on. What do I have? I have about 7 minutes. So let me get into this whole thing of the church and social justice. What really pushed my button on this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, I want you to go read the articles for yourself, but pushed my button is that there is a young gentleman that is doing fabulous work for the New Christian Intellectual, is Cody Libolt. I've been on his program before, and he sent out this email that has an article called "A Failing Movement, John MacArthur on Social Justice." And the article is actually written by Sam Jones, and it was posted in thechristianintellectual.com. There is a whole concept of how do you stand up. When the church should stand up, the body of Christ, the believer, should stand up for what is morally correct and take those positions. You hear me talking about it all the time, that pastors are refusing to take the position of what is going on politically and morally, whether they preach it from the pulpit or not. And like I told you several weeks ago, even Spurgeon preached from the pulpit on socialism. So social justice should be something that's preached about from the pulpit. And I'm going to reference quickly here one of the pastors from the Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution. Anyway, one of the signers, John MacArthur, big church out of California. He's been here to Ohio to the church that we used to attend. And, the whole point is that he was one of the original signers of what's called this Dallas Statement, the Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel. A lot of good stuff in there. The majority of it, I have to say I'm all about, except for one thing, and I'm not going to get into that detail. But MacArthur takes and colludes with pastors that are social justice warriors. Calls them his friends, calls them, that they worked hard for the gospel, but you know what? Hey, on this issue, there's this whole thing about tolerance. You know what? There is no such thing as tolerance. That's what gotten us into the problem that we're in. No leadership, no leadership whatsoever. That's a frustrating aspect of what happened in the church that I was attending and Kathy and I were attending here. Leadership lacking in most of the modern churches and the extensibility of the gospel, as I always talk about. So let's talk about this. A few of the New England clergy who served as chaplains in the French War lived to act in the same capacity in the Revolutionary War struggle. Among these was Benjamin Pomeroy, who was born in Suffield, Connecticut in 1704. Having graduated at Yale College in 1733 with the highest honors of his class, he devoted a short time to the study of theology and 2 years after was ordained pastor of the church in Hebron, Connecticut. Having identified himself with the great religious excitement which commenced about 1740, he was called a New Light. So I just want to remind you what was going on in 1740 is what we in modern times, and it didn't even receive its name until the 1800s, is called the First Great Awakening. So he was one of those guys, a new light in that First Great Awakening, and as such became obnoxious to the bigoted, intolerant act of 1742 passed by the state to prevent, it was said, the great disorders caused by these revivalists. You know what? I think the first ones on the bandwagon in modern times would be those social justice warriors against revivalists, no different than Benjamin Pomeroy. So being arraigned before the assembly, he was tried and acquitted, though he narrowly escaped personal violence at the hand of the excited crowd who had assembled to witness the trial. 2 years after, he was brought again before the assembly for having denounced its intolerant edicts, especially for saying on fast day, and I want you to get this point. If I don't get through anything else, get this point, because this is what John MacArthur should have been saying about the social justice warriors. Okay? And here it is. Here's what Pomeroy says. Quote, great men had fallen in with those that were on the devil's side and enemies to the kingdom of Christ, that they had raised such persecution in the land that if there be a faithful minister of the Lord Jesus, he must lose his estate. That if he therefore be faithful man in civil authority, he must lose his honor and usefulness. And there was no colony so bad as Connecticut for persecuting these laws. End of quote. So where I want to go with that in the last minute and a half that I have is that the social justice warriors have been going after the intellectuals that are Christ-based. The social justice warriors are going after the political leaders that stand against social justice warriors. In businesses, the social justice warriors have taken and consumed within the context of having majorities or good portions, even 5% of the stock of major corporations, and forcing the hands of businesses to adopt social justice warrior sin. Pastors have adopted social justice warrior positions, and we either get what MacArthur's doing and capitulating and being tolerant of it instead of standing up, as our friend here, Pomeroy, says, the devil's side. Not only that, we see it in the media. We see it in every aspect of our society and all of the affairs of mankind. As I mentioned earlier, if Spurgeon was willing to stand up against socialism and other economic issues, where are those that signed on to the Dallas statement standing up loudly against other pastors, their friends who are social justice warriors? Ladies and gentlemen, I'll go with Benjamin Pomeroy more than John MacArthur ever. So with that, Sam Adams got it right, and so did those anti-federalists. Come on back for the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right. And I always, in this segment, want to let you know about Liberty Works Radio Network. Liberty Works Radio Network is a fabulous network of where you can get a whole spectrum of information regarding our heritage, our godly heritage, as well as some really good stuff on constitutionalism. A lot of good things live in the local Maryland market, as well as other information that comes from across the country and gets out across the country. So go check out all that other programming, and please take and hit that donate button and participate, because this is a listener-funded network. And now, myself, Tom Navolis, your host, let's get into what I wanted to talk about in the second segment, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program. Not at the last, but at the last beginning. So with that, we'll have some fun around George Washington, but I really got to read some of this stuff to you, because there's no other way to comprehend and put together what I want to put together around George Washington's farewell address and some of the dynamics that are happening within the Trump administration, moving to bring foundational principles back to reality in this nation. We've gone so far from it. We've gone so far into globalism. We've gone so far into the entanglements that George Washington warned us not to get involved in. So let's take a look. So let's start back here. He kind of gets way up into this, and I talked about it a little bit last week, where he says, so likewise, a passionate attachment of one nation to another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation, facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists, and infusing into one the enmities of the other, betrays the former into participation in the quarrels and wars of the latter without adequate inducement or justification. This goes on to a lot of the bilateral or the trade agreements that we've seen in the past, and even some of the security agreements that we've seen since the UN came into formation, is that we have seen these produce this variety of evils. We've seen these sympathies, and especially in this trade stuff, a favorite nation status. So how do you give China favorite nation status? How do you do that? Where'd that come from? They're an enemy. And that's what had happened under the Clinton administration in particular. Blows my mind. Absolutely blows my mind. You can go through and continue to look at that paragraph there. And he talks about it leads also to concessions to the favorite nation of privileges denied to others, which is apt doubly to injure the nation making the concessions by unnecessarily parting with what ought to have been retained, and by exciting jealousies, ill will, and a disposition of related or retaliated issues, a disposition to retaliate in the parties from whom equal privileges are withheld. So a lot of stuff happens. So fair trade, not just free trade, fair trade. That's fundamentally what George Washington was talking about. You know, he talks about, again, the insidious wiles of foreign influence. I conjure to believe me, my fellow citizens, the jealousies of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. I could go on and on about that alone, because we know in education we do not teach that aspect of truth and history any longer. We just don't teach it. Education has taken and said, oh, all nations are wonderful. In fact, I had an associate pastor of a large church tell me, well, there's nothing special about America. We don't consider anything special about America. I don't go to that church anymore. Yeah, it's just very, very interesting is that in what I talked about in the first segment and what I'll talk about in the second segment relative to what happened within the churches. But here's Washington just warning from that, political position, as well as what that would mean for trade, what it would mean for all of our other treaty aspects. You just don't want to get entangled that way. And it's harmful, baneful, not just baneful, but most baneful foes of Republican government. Wow. I really am thankful for what Donald Trump is doing in reviewing all of these treaties, even in Central America, and pulling the money away from them, because what we have done is exactly this, is that these insidious influences, even from third world countries via the UN, are baneful to our republic. Hey, Democrats and you Republican, pukin senators, Republican, that's different than a Republican. Well, that is the Republicans. What am I talking about? The Republican senators that went against the emergency order of the president? You political cowards. You're despicable and despised right here by George Washington. He puts it on your head. May judgment come upon you. Anyway, sorry about that. I got a little emotional there. All right. Washington continues, and where I wanted to go with the program today. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Unfortunately, George, what you had there was a clean slate, and you had some things. Some of them were good and some of them were not. We have all these entanglements of treaties. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, if you have not looked, I will remind you from a number of programs ago that we have, and it's in the book, okay? And those folks that can't see me on YouTube that are on the radio program, pointing back to my book, From Covenant to the Present Constitution. In there is a chapter talking about the UN and the fact that we have over 10,000 entanglements. 10,000 entanglements. Wow. Sadly, I can't go with George's statement there that we should try and fulfill them with perfect good faith, because those entanglements have no good faith wrapped to them. They're just sucking the money out of us. They're stealing from my adult children when they were children, and my grandchildren, and my grandchildren's grandchildren. Yeah, that's to the fourth generation, the fifth generation. Thieves in those treaties. George Washington continues. Here, let us stop. I already stopped. Oh, here's the one. Here it is, EU. George Washington is talking to you, EU. Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none, or a very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics or the ordinary combinations and collisions of her friendships or enmities. Wow. Wish we would have listened to that. Our detached and a distant situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course. This is where President Trump, he must have read this paragraph. If we remain one people under an efficient government, the period is not far off when we may defy material injury from external annoyances, when we may take such an attitude as will cause the neutrality we may at any time resolve upon to scrupulously respect it, when belligerent nations, under the impossibility of making acquisitions upon us, will not lightly hazard the giving us provocation, when we may choose peace or war as our interest, guided by justice, shall counsel. Wow, that alone is a mouthful. When I hear President Trump, when I heard him speak at the State of the Union, when I heard him speak at that major rally, when I heard him speak over the course of these last 2 years, what an echoing of George Washington comes into his speeches. Washington continues, why forego the advantages of so peculiar a situation? Why quit our own to stand upon foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambitions, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? Why do it? Why have we done it? What have the internationalists done for us except suck the money and wealth out of this nation? You know, what George Washington was saying is America first. America first. Make and keep America great. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world so far, I mean, as we are now at liberty to do it. For let me not be understood as capable of patronizing infidelity to existing engagements. I hold the maxim no less applicable to public than to private affairs that honesty is always the best policy. I repeat it, therefore, let those engagements be observed in their genuine sense, but in my opinion, it is unnecessary and would be unwise to extend them, taking care always to keep ourselves by suitable establishments on a respectable defensive posture. We may safely trust to temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies. So if we had to deal with the world war, pull out when we're done. Don't be a nation builder. Don't get involved necessarily, really, in rebuilding all of Europe and rebuilding Asia and rebuilding all of these other things that have taken advantage of us. Are they really in our best interest? No. We've always had the resources here in America to be self-sustaining. We can do it. And I think that's one of the things that President Trump really understands. The global entanglements were for the benefits of those in these various other nations, as well as for those greedy people here in America that have established cabal to change this republic into something other than what was foundationally intended right here by George Washington in some of these paragraphs of his farewell address. Ladies and gentlemen, go back and read this. This is what Sam Adams understood. This is what the Anti-Federalists talked about. It's amazing to me that in the context of the farewell address that George Washington in so many ways confirmed what the Anti-Federalists were talking about. You know what? Fair trade, self-defense, make America great, keep America great. I think that, I really do think that Donald Trump has the spirit of George Washington within his framework and what his administration is doing. So come on back for the last segment as we follow up from the first segment here. Samuel Adams returns. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right. And this is, again, Tom Novelis, your host. So thanks for being here. We're going to jump in deep and hard. In the first segment, what I talked about was the failing movement, John MacArthur, on social justice. I brought out a little bit of information about the Dallas Statement and the Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel, and the reality and fact, as I've mentioned often, that there are a lot of pastors out there that are wimps. They don't want to talk about this, or worse, to what I pointed out from the first segment relative to what Pastor Benjamin Pomeroy said back during the conflicts of 1742, is that there's a lot of pastors at that time that were on the side of the devil. So that meant those that were on the side of Toryism, those that were on the side that were against revivalists, those that were on the side against Reformation in the church, those that would be on the side of today, the social justice warriors. So how's this bending coming about? Where's that perversion from what we would have expected and has happened forever in the churches? I mean, we've seen, and Jesus even predicted, to the extent that we would see people that would be, somewhat false teachers, that there would be a lot of truth, but boy, they'd get off on the wacky end of things, and especially in relationship to our republic. And the fact that we are supposed to be a moral and virtuous people, and without that, we can't govern properly. The Constitution means nothing. Just as a reminder, I know you've heard it a million times. Okay, here's 1,000,001, is that Madison said, he said that the Constitution is for a moral and virtuous people. No one else could handle it. No one else can implement it. No one else can see it through. So with what we have, as I always give you the isms, we have the ists, the humanism, socialism, communism, all of the other isms, jihadism. I know I made that word up. Jihadists, we'll say the ist side. And we have them sitting in the halls of Congress. Therefore, as I say, and as I've been putting out for a long period of time, the Kozak plan is in operation with pressure from above and pressure from below, and we're seeing this compression. And you can go read, and not a shot is fired, and we're on that road, especially now with all these workers of the devil inside of our legislatures in our states and at the federal level. Remember that one of the Muslim jihadist congresswomen has said that now the Muslims are here and taking over America. They've done it in Minnesota with the recent election within their assembly. Interesting. Well, here's where it all started. I left it off and I had to ramble really, really fast, and I don't want to cut us off this week, but I want to bring you back to a great article and the resources that were there and are here this week, Conforming the Church to New World Order. You got to go through the UNESCO Declaration, read all about that. That affects education. UNESCO is all about the UN education crowd. Radical roots of the World Health Organization, reinventing the world, collectivism in churches, collaborators with communism, and the Secretary of State under Eisenhower is the one that helped take and bring all of this evil into effect in 1942. And as I said in the last program last week that John Foster Dulles in 42 was a member and a delegate with 30 other delegates, 15 of which were bishops, 7 seminary presidents or cemetery presidents, and 8 college and university presidents came together in the Federal Council of Churches. And what they were concerned about and put out in a report from that gathering in 1942, a world government of delegated powers, and immediate limitations on national sovereignty, international control of all armies and navies, universal system of money, worldwide freedom of immigration, which we're seeing just overloading us today, a democratically controlled international bank, geez, that's the Federal Reserve came in 1913, and the World Bank, even distribution of the world's natural wealth. I will use the acronym, but not give the name any credence. The communist AOC, even distribution of all the wealth. So soon after that, Time magazine wrote a summary of the report, and here's what it said in a statement. A new order through voluntary cooperation within the framework of democracy or through explosive political revolution. The solution, voluntary cooperation within the framework of democracy, gives a glimpse of the true meaning of nice-sounding words such as democracy, volunteerism, and participation. Partnerships, PPPs, and civil society. Wow, nice words. We hear a lot of that. We hear social justice, on and on and on. Economics, the sensational as the extreme internationalism of political programs. In 1943, John Foster Dulles convened another Council of Churches conference. It endorsed 6 pillars of peace, a plea for a world political organization, a United Nations. In his speech recorded in the council in 1944 biannual report, Dulles said, quote, interest in this subject have been enormously increased by the declaration of the Moscow Conference, which stressed the necessity of creating, at the earliest possible moment, a general international organization. This statement, signed by more than 1,000 Protestant leaders, was given to the press and mailed to the President and members of Congress. The most famous council leader that was there at that World Council of Churches or at the Federal Council of Churches was Alger Hiss. And Alger Hiss worked for President Roosevelt in a statement in 1945, putting together, under the Yalta Peace Conference, nothing other than the UN Charter. Secretariat General of the United Nations Organizing Conference in San Francisco in 1945. That's all Alger Hiss. The Soviet connection may even have encouraged John Foster Dulles to recommend that Hiss head up the multi-million-dollar Carnegie Endowment for International Peace afterwards. Folks, you know, this is all documented. This is not fantasy. This all ties into what is happening today and the tolerance allowed by many well-known pastors, friends of John MacArthur, and others that I won't mention in Northeast Ohio, that are in fact social justice warriors that are tied into all this UN insanity, whether they realize it or not. They're, you know what? They're enemies of God and they're enemies of the state. They're enemies of our republic. There's a, you know, our friends in the Methodist Church went through all sorts of issues and are still going through it. Out of this council, in 1948, Bishop Bromley Oxnam, president of the American wing of the newly formed World Council of Churches, announced the council slogan. Here's the council slogan: one church for one world. Methodism is determined to preach a gospel that insists that all men are brothers and children of one Father to whom final loyalty is due. Sounds great, But you know what? There's a lot of issues there. Oh, so much more that I want to take you through on this in a little book called Seeing the Invisible, Ordinary People as Extraordinary Faith. Shows the similarities between politically correct 17th century England and our nation at the dawn of the third millennium. October 1662 was a dark month for the Church of Jesus Christ in Scotland, comparable only to Black Bartholomew Day in England 2 months earlier. Then 2,000 English pastors and teachers had been evicted for their unwillingness to comply with the terms of the Act of Uniformity. All Scottish preachers were required to seek preordination at the hands of the bishops, a measure to which few could submit in good conscience. Those who would not comply would lose their ministries forthwith. So much more. Anyway, the only good Scottish preacher that I can speak of at the present goes back to none other than John Witherspoon. Oh, he wasn't in the present. Gee whiz, he was at the founding of this nation. Yeah, he's about the best Scottish preacher that I can identify. Anyway, as we continue, in conjunction with this, I mentioned to you the site of the Institution for Authority Research, authorityresearch.com. I will say that I have talked about for a long time Hegelian dialectics and how they're used by the socialists, how they're used by the World Council of Churches, how it's used and schmoozed in with the social justice warriors. They use a dialectic, and they use it within the context of the churches as well. So I would highly recommend that you go to authorityresearch.com, and this is put together by Dr. Dean Gotcher. He happens to be a professor at, let me see if I can find where he's at. Let's see, he's a PhD in education, psychology, and philosophy. I mean, he's, spanning 5 years. He's read a whole about 600 psychological books on psychology and more. He did a lot of interesting work relative to Goals 2000. He's a speaker. He, let's see, holds conferences in Dallas. He's very, very interesting. Anyway, the things that I wanted to mention about this site is that he really digs in on how the dialectic has attacked the church. The dialectic, he calls it a praxis of socialist liberals as children of disobedience, reasoning from their feelings of the moment. That's what's going on with social emotional learning, and we're going to try and get our friend Adam Reddick back sometime. We were going to have him back in February, but I don't know. He just has a jamming schedule as a college student and working with one of our state board of education members who's really solid. But this isn't nothing new, and I say there's nothing new under the sun. So when evil wants to attack, evil pulls out every trick in the book, and one of the tricks in the book is the Hegelian dialectic. That takes and wants tolerance, wants to take and push you and I aside for taking and having truth, making us look bad. All of the things that we see going on in the press, at the universities, stomping out on our free speech, on and on it goes, is all part of this movement that has now perfected the use of the dialectic in every aspect of our society, including our churches, including what we started the first segment with, a failing movement, and Mr. John MacArthur. So as we have to consider this, I think what you need to do this week is to take and read the documents that I have put forward for you to consider in the references. There's a lot there. Will it take you a lifetime to read all of it? I don't know. Maybe you need to take a speed reading course. But the reality is, folks, if we are going to take and continue the framework of this nation to the honor of God, then we need to understand this stuff and be informed. And come on back next week when Sam Adams returns and those anti federalists, they have and do get it right.